Hello, everybody. Once again, this afternoon. My name is Marta Keil. I'm curator and researcher based in Warsaw, Poland, and I'm one of the instigators of the Grand Reunion project, who is investigating the notion of contemporary choreography practices in the context of the, let's say, current social, economic, and mainly political constellations we operate within. The project has been planned to take place live, but for obvious reasons, the pandemic outbreak it never had. And together with 4 other instigators, the majority of them is here with us today. We decided to translate in a way the live event into a series of online events and gatherings, and to see what can be created out of this line of regular meetings every month. And we are slowly coming to an end. Now it's in April gathering, we're gonna have 2 more and then it's over. And in April, I was super happy and very lucky to be able to invite Zeynep Bükünlü to co-curate with me the April gathering and the April issue. And by issue, I mean the online magazine that or short kind of magazine that we cooked up together with Zeina, and later on I will paste a link to it. It's already online, you can have a look. And together with Zeina and the artists, researchers, thinkers, we invited to this issue. We wanted to tackle the notion of interdependence or interdependencies, and to actually kind of see the choreography territory from a broader perspective. So we decided not to focus only on the choreographic practices, but actually to look a little bit beyond and see where the choreographic practices are actually situated and how does it influence them. So for instance, what is the constellation of the desires, of the urgencies we all as makers, thinkers, researchers, artists operate within? How are the bonds, the collaborative bonds created, and with whom do we create them? And what is the landscape of the relations with humans and modern humans in that field and beyond? And we were especially interested in the notion of thinking of the interdependencies. We're especially interested in the various contexts in which we operate and the kind of complexity of the ecosystem we work in, but also on the everyday basis, but also in this kind of ambiguity that is related to the notion of the solidarity and care, especially recently being heavily, so to speak, present in the public debates, and very often being misused, abused, if you like, or overused. And we were also wondering how to address the notion of the solidarity from the point of view we're in at the moment. Also because that very notion was at the very basis of the Grand Reunion project. We wanted to kind of reflect the agency of contemporary choreography. And since the context we work in has changed quite a lot since during the last year, or maybe it did not change that much, some aspects of that context have been amplified by the pandemic. We're wondering how is thinking of solidarity in the arts field and beyond even possible nowadays, and how to approach it?
Well, actually, it was a really good summary that what we are trying to do. So I will just continue what we were hoping to discuss in this gathering with Begüm Özdenfırat and Tomislav Medag. We wish to reflect on neoliberal crisis of care, potentials and limits of solidarity networks, community and neighborhood organizations, highlighted by, but not limited to, the current crisis. We wish to question changing meanings of practices of solidarity and care, and possibilities of piracy and politicization of care organizing. For this, like, we were happily came together with, first of all, Begüm Özdağ, sociology in Mimar Sinan Fine Arts University in Turkey. She works in the fields of visual culture, urban sociology, and social movement studies. She is the co-editor of Commitment and Complicity in Cultural Theory and Practice, Cultural Activism, Practices, Dilemmas, Possibilities, and Aesthetics and Resistance in the Age of Global Uprisings. Her book, entitled Encounters with the Ottoman Miniature Contemporary Readings of an Imperial Art, is published by Taurus in 2015. And she's one of the directors of documentary Welcome Lenin and the director of short experimental video Delight Well. And Begüm will go first, but after her we will be together with Tomislav Medak, who is a doctoral student at the Center for Post-Digital Cultures. And Medak is a member of the theory and publishing team of Multimedia Institute in Zagreb, as well as an amateur librarian for the Memory of the World project. And his research focuses on technologies, capitalist development, and post-capitalist transition, particularly on economies of intellectual property and unevenness of technoscience. So welcome, and Begüm, please.
Okay. Thank you all, and good evening, everyone. I'm happy to be here with you all. And there is actually a weekend lockdown and already a curfew in all over Turkey. So I cannot be outside of my flat anyways, and it's a good reason to be inside. And I should thank Carolina, Marta, and Zaino and the rest of the Grand Reunion team for giving me this opportunity and actually spicing up my otherwise boring Saturday evening. Actually, we have quite a limited time, and I'm actually looking forward to hear Tomislav as well. And so I actually want to jump right into my topic, but before I delve deep into that discussion, I need to give a remark regarding the title of my talk, at least the first portion of it. It's Failed Solidarities, especially the failed one, the failure one. Because over the years, I have used this notion of a failure, especially in relation to social struggles and social movements and global uprisings. And whenever I used this term, I immediately got many responses from the audience, and I was constantly told that our movements would and should never fail, as we never aim for total victory, because social movement organization is a process, which I totally agree. But at the same time, I do believe that our movements fail most of the time and fail to deliver its potentials, at least. And it's mostly due to structural conditions. So understanding such political or historical dynamics like that makes us fail might help us, or might help our movements to fail better, next time. So I insist that we use the term failure in a productive way. And I know that it is the states, it's the governments, rather than the people, who actually failed to face the COVID crisis, for example, in a human way or humane way, to say the least. People all over the world did not fail to show solidarity with one another. They didn't fail to organize mutual aid groups either. So that's a given. But based on my previous research on local urban communing movements and post-Gezi uprising neighborhood assemblies and mutual aid practices in Turkey, this evening I would like to touch upon the potentials and, maybe more importantly, the dilemmas and limits of what we can call pandemic solidarity networks. So my talk will focus on the situation in Turkey, but I guess, and hope actually, I hope that the questions I try and raise would have a larger reach than their country of origin, Because I think the emergence of neoliberal authoritarian populist regimes all over the world, unfortunately, and the socio-political conditions triggered by the pandemic makes us share a similar, if not a common ground. I wanted to remind you, at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a clear division between public intellectuals and the ways they read the nature of the pandemic. There was this one line that we can call like this alarmist, pessimists, intellectuals like symbolized in Giorgio Agamben's position, who denied, for example, pandemic measures as what we can call techno-medical despotism. On the opposing side, there were those who claimed that the pandemic crisis should be taken as an opportunity, as it made the crisis of neoliberalism obvious in the eyes of the masses and the impotency of the neoliberal state visible. So actually this first line of thought has absolutely nothing to say about grassroots politics based on mutual aid and ethics of solidarity. So I will leave that aside. It is the second line of thought I would like to critically engage with. In his article, Life as Commons, my comrade Stavros Stavridis argued that, and I quote him, the coronavirus pandemic crisis has triggered a new wave of collective practices, making it clear another form of social organization is urgently needed, unquote. And he suggested that this process signaled towards an intensive production of the common, and he defined it as both the form and the content of social relations that transcend the limitations of market relations and market discipline. And then he identified 3 different factors that shape the rise of the common in, against, and beyond the pandemic crisis. And these factors are, first, the need for survival, especially for those living in the peripheries of big cities, in stigmatized communities, and indigenous ghettos. And secondly, he identified another factor as the continuity of the long established experiences of cooperation in communities. And finally, he identified the third factor as the spread of concrete ideas for a world of equality and solidarity beyond capitalism, which started well beyond the pandemic broke out. And he emphasized, in the context of the pandemic crisis, collective survival efforts, cooperation potentialities, and aspirations for a just society converge. It was so because, again, in his words, many people are forced to realize that if they don't take their lives in their own hands, they are meant to be expendable. It is in this experience-based understanding that opens minds and hearts to the hope of a different future, he wrote. So this position, I believe, relies on a common expectation that the failure of the capitalist system in reproducing itself will eventually lead to a systemic change, which will be led from below, especially in the realm of social reproduction. While I agree with this suggestion that the pandemic awakened forms of mutual aid and collective care that were actually offshoots of the recent wave of global uprisings, I also believe that focusing on the potential failures and paradoxes of such scale and form of politics is extremely important. This is what I will hopefully do in this presentation. I will not talk about the general pandemic situation in Turkey, but I think it will be suffice to refer to the so-called coronavirus relief package declared by President Erdogan back in March 2020. This package explicitly allocated state resources to corporations. Around the same time, the Ministry of Health publicly announced that, and I quote him, everyone should declare and organize their own state of emergency. From then on, that is by March 2020, it was clear that the state would employ measures to primarily relieve companies rather than the people, and caring for oneself and one's community was deemed an individual responsibility. This coronavirus relief package was a turning point in the organization of bottom-up mutual aid and collective care groups in Turkey. In most cities in Turkey, there were already such solidarity groups since the Gezi uprising in 2013. Indeed, the political situation and the affective state triggered by the pandemic reminded many the so-called spirit of Gezi. And that spirit of Gezi was defined by Karakayakalı and Yaka, and I quote them: "The spirit of Gezi is a collective, is an ideal of collectivity and solidarity on the one hand, and the sisterhood of people of all ethnicities and identities on the other," unquote. So during the Gezi uprising, the organization of life, from food to caregiving, so strongly related to the public sphere, was carried out in the public encampments over days and nights. The spontaneous and coordinated collective practices of organizing the revolutionary everyday in the occupied park made crowds experience those abstract political ideas of participation, collaboration, solidarity, and mutuality. So when the infrastructure of the occupation was forcefully evicted by security forces and the objects and practices of mutual aid and solidarity were taken apart, the spirit of Gezi was immediately transported to the neighborhood assemblies. Within a week, some 65 forums were being held daily on different squares and public parks in Istanbul alone. And there were more than 50 locations across the country. Soon, this scale of the neighborhood became a political level, and the acts of care and solidarity were considered one of the main political goals and achievements of the uprising. When the pandemic broke out, actually, a few of these assemblies were still active, and many of them were in the hibernation mood or mode. The declaration of the coronavirus relief package became a turning point that activated these solidarity networks against the local effects of the pandemic. So there were at least 12 groups active in Istanbul, for example, and they formed a bigger online network called Dayanışmalı. So these groups gathered volunteers to produce, for example, masks with 3D printers, and they delivered food to healthcare professionals and delivered food and medicine to people in need. And they took care of the elderly, walked their dogs, for example, and they brought food if and when necessary. So in what follows, I put forward my critical concerns and questions about the potentials and dilemmas faced by pre- and post-pandemic networks of solidarity in Turkey, and I will call them 6 factors impeding the rise of the common in, against, and beyond the pandemic crisis as a response to Stavrides's article I mentioned in the beginning of my talk. So the first 2 factors are related to the organizational forms, demands, and action repertoires of mutual aid groups, while the final 4 had to do with the transformation of the nature of the political regime in Turkey and socio-historical structuring of urban neighborhoods and sedimented cultures of solidarity. So the first of these factors, I would call it how the solidarity groups defined the scale of the neighborhood. So post-Gezi assemblies or neighborhood assemblies put forward a dichotomous understanding of the notion of the neighborhood. The neighborhood, it was seen as a social unit constructed by everyday acts of neighborhood solidarity and care on the one hand, and on the other, again, it was the neighborhood conceived as the center of political mobilization where issues related to macro or institutional politics are acted out locally. So there was a tension between these 2 scales and 2 different understanding of what neighborhood is, and the tension between them was never resolved. The pandemic networks seem to carry this sustained tension between practices of everyday solidarity and political ideals of, let's say, freedom and equality. Mutual aid groups rely on the idea of neighborliness, for example, and they take it as a powerful and widely practiced informal mode of localized and mutual community care, providing what the care collective calls promiscuous care. Simultaneously, the mutual aid groups take the scale of neighborhood as a political unit that should mobilize locals in the service of the institutionalized politics, say against the neoliberal state. This unresolved tension actually led to a discontinuous and a non-institutionalized form of autonomous local politics. This is why we keep on seeing mostly ad hoc committees and modular groups reacting to certain alarming issue rather than, for example, aiming at building the institutions of the commons. Secondly, I should talk about the gendered relations of the household, which is never mentioned by the solidarity networks. Because the solidarity networks relate to the unit of the household and the family. And these networks are extremely useful in helping us to think about care beyond nuclear family, for example, or beyond the state. Yet they hardly regard the household or home as a unit of their operation, and they never critically intervene in issues relating to the organization of domestic work, which is, since the outbreak of the pandemic, has become the locus of distance working, distance learning, and the ordinary social reproduction. In this sense, it is telling that almost all networks argue that pandemic is a crisis illustrating all the problems of the system, capitalist system, all problems relating to the incompetence of the government and their unwillingness to take care of the people. Yet these mutual aid groups rarely talk about the politics of the family and the gendered organization of care work within the family. By neglecting that, or by so doing, these groups envision a politics of care not within or inside homes, but only across households. And third factor, I would call a culture war and strangers like me. As in many authoritarian populist regimes in the world, the political regime in Turkey targets and mobilizes the unit of the neighborhood so as to harvest microforms of conservative, nationalist, and patriarchal politics on a local, everyday basis. In Turkey, in the last decade, we observed the rise of micropolitics of the neighborhood, in which the muhtar, the elected chief of the neighborhood, esnaf, the local shop owners, and bekçis, newly appointed neighborhood security forces, they were all being addressed directly by President Erdogan as the owners and the sustainers of the political regime. Hence, these local men, all men, are invited to take care of the neighborhood in the name of the state. Simultaneously, the neighborhood as a unit has been turned into a metaphoric war zone where a culture war between two rivaling and historically constructed lifestyles is being fought. Secular against Islamic, westernized against the national or homemade. Hence, the neighborhood as a notion and a unit of social organization is entirely mobilized and consolidated along the lines of class and cultural political difference. In this context, while lockdown measures and self-isolation processes proved the importance of bottom-up and place-based forms of mutual aid, these acts also turned the scale of neighborhood into a political fetish. Under these circumstances, which I believe to have a global resonance, neighborhood initiatives and mutual aid groups, while much needed, might strengthen the political axis of authoritarian populism by dividing, the neighborhood into lifestyle groups. Along these lines, the CARE Collective suggests calling care networks operating on the level of neighborhood as strangers like me, and they define this strangers like me as forms of care carried out by strangers whose lives resemble our own. They emphasize that the more challenging issue is imagining new models of caring across difference. This is a burning question, given the social and physical urban conditions of the pandemic, which locks communities down in their neighborhoods, where people share a similar lifestyle based on class and identity. Finding ways of physically and politically going beyond caring for strangers like me is a strategic question yet to be answered. And the fourth factor I would call the positioning of the state versus the local government. As the neighborhood became the unit of political mobilization for the authoritarian populist regime of Erdogan, taking care of social relations in the scale of the neighborhood became a populist tool for the opponents of the regime as well, such as the Istanbul and Ankara metropolitan municipalities run by the opposing Republican People's Party. At the height of the first wave of the pandemic, both municipalities launched solidarity campaigns, as they called it, and they collected donations on a national level. These campaigns were immediately declared illegal by the Ministry of Interior Affairs. And as a response, President Erdogan launched his own very own national solidarity campaign and donated 7 monthly salaries of his salary and asked citizens and companies to join this campaign. So simultaneously, the Ministry of Interior Affairs mobilized local men to organize their own local solidarity campaigns in the name of the state. So as such, organizing charity campaigns under the banner of solidarity on the level of the neighborhood became a populist tool used both by the state institutions and elected local governments. This situation actually makes the work of autonomous groups of mutual aid extremely difficult. And the fifth factor is the existing of local networks of solidarity, or already existing local networks of solidarity. Actually, the urban culture of Turkey relies on mainly the operation of local networks of kinship and fellow countrymen, creating a dense and very successful informal relations of mutual support. Besides, religious communities carry out intensive charity work and support their members financially and socially. These informal networks are recognized and sometimes even supported by state institutions. Such networks, based on religious identity and city of origin, support their members materially and emotionally, creating and sustaining a mood of solidarity. The already existing informal networks make the work of autonomous solidarity groups superfluous. And sixth and the final factor impeding the rise of the common, institutions of the common, is the conceptualization of charity and solidarity. Under such conditions, campaigns organized by local mutual aid groups run the risk of becoming impractical and even redundant, as the conceptual and practical differences between the notions of solidarity, charity, and aid blur. Most of the autonomous solidarity networks insist on the difference between state-led financial aids and their own bottom-up campaigns. They argue that the state aid actually objectifies and stigmatizes the person it helps as the poor, and it mystifies the real cause of poverty. In contrast, for example, Fatih Solidarity Network based in Istanbul define their perspective of solidarity as the kindness of the oppressed, where they argue the supplies and hygiene materials they put in solidarity boxes should be taken as a means of dialogue between the oppressed. This dialogue is believed to open up a greater political horizon of organization. Yet in the political and social context that I've been describing so far, where the culture of charity and Islamic aid is prevalent and predominant, opening such a dialogue of mutual empowerment proves to be challenging, if not impossible. These 6 factors, having to do with the restructuring of the state in the past decade and the formation of authoritarian populist regimes, have been developing well before the pandemic broke out. The pandemic and the state's ways of dealing with this, with its social consequences, such as lockdowns, social distancing, and self-isolation, strengthened the effects of these factors on the level of the neighborhood. While the politics of care and solidarity and a politics based on mutual aid are strong practices and ideals spread by our various movements, they have been hijacked and mobilized by populist regimes and their opponents alike, such as local governments. Mutual aid, solidarity, and commoning practices indeed become most visible during periods of deep crisis and demonstrate that states and capitalist markets do fail in addressing the emergency situation. Yet simultaneously, these crises also make it clear that our politics might, and most of the time do, fail to address the situation and bring about social change. I should stop here, I guess, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Begum. I think you also leave at the point that Tomislav has a lot to add. So, yeah.
Thank you, Zeno. And I would like to thank to Marta, Carolina, and you, Zeno, for the invitation, and Grand Reunion for organizing this afternoon's session. I'm really enthused to be sharing the panel with Begum and you all. And those were some clear thoughts to a very particular situation in Turkey. I enjoyed that immensely. First, in my presentation, I will first give sort of an overview of what, together with Valeria Graziano and Marcel Mars, I've been developing over the last 2-3 years within the project Pirate Care. And from there on, I'll reflect on the work we've been doing in documenting various practices of mutual aid and solidarity in the pandemic, to sort of open up toward a reflection on discontents with care and current political contestation of the situation of response to the pandemic that Begum has in detail described, but I'll describe in sort of larger strokes. So Pirate Care is a project that we have convened in 2018 with the objective to map, connect collective practices that are emerging in response to what Nancy Fraser has called neoliberal crisis of care. So a convergence of processes that include austerity cuts to the welfare systems, the rollout of workfare, the attack on reproductive rights, or criminalization of migration and solidarity with migrants. All these processes deny care or sort of vital support to many. And in response to that denial, practices we have called Pirate Care are organizing to help migrants survive at sea and land, provide pregnancy terminations where those are illegal, offer health support where institutions fail, self-organize childcare where public provision does not extend to everyone, or liberate knowledge where access is denied, as is the case with our Memory of the World project and other shadow libraries. Crucially, all these initiatives share a willingness to openly disobey laws. This characteristic, to disobey laws and to politicize that disobedience, is what defines them in our eyes as pirate care, as piracies, forms of piracy. Our project specifically aims to activate collective learning processes from the knowledge generated in and through these practices of organizing. In this, we have been inspired by the phenomenon we have named #syllabus, that is crowdsourced online syllabus or syllabi created by social movements in response to situations of intense antagonism. Sort of a couple of guiding examples for us were hashtag Ferguson syllabus that was created in 2014 in response to the police killing of Michael Brown and Ferguson, or gaming and feminism syllabus created in response to the Gamergate harassment campaign also in 2014, or Standing Rock syllabus that was created in response to the Dakota and Nakota Nations standoff at the Dakota Access Pipeline fossil fuel project. We have written about this phenomenon in an article which we have titled Learning from hashtag Syllabus. And there we have promised to develop a radical pedagogy approach that would help social justice initiatives write online syllabi of their own, and to do so in a technological framework. So let's call it a platform that will allow that the syllabi, as well as the collections of texts that accompany those syllabi, be collectively created, easily preserved, and maintained independent from large digital platforms. That technological framework we have developed and is called Sendpoints, and is currently hosting growing number of interesting projects, such as machine listening curriculum, or the latest issue of the TOVO, which is a journal of Nubian studies. However, as a first such syllabus, we have started building with practitioners of pirate care, activists and scholars, a syllabus on, well, pirate care. And the first round of topics that are included in the syllabus, you can peruse syllabus by entering syllabus.pirate.care in your browser. So the first round of topics were written in November of 2019, and there are around 15 topics that cover anything from organizing of care labor, over housing struggles, to mental health support. Just check it for yourself. And the syllabus we have launched on March 8th last year. So just a couple of days after we launched the syllabus, the COVID-19 pandemic broke out across Europe. So we have rolled out our work on the syllabus into a collective note-taking effort to document organizing of mutual aid, solidarity, and care in response to the crisis. Some of that were already pre-existing networks, such as the one that Begum described. Others were spontaneously organized. We have titled that documenting effort, Flatten the Curve, Grow the Care, which is a reference to that famous graph that depicts sort of a spike in the number of cases and sort of the ground line that shouldn't be crossed, that denotes the healthcare system capacity. I'll come to that in a moment. And with the participation of a broader private care network, we have immediately created around 15 notes, instructions, and how-tos that were coming from and were used by mutual aid organizers in Italy, Croatia, the UK, and elsewhere. The notes include information on how to assist people in home isolation, or how to organize solidarity kitchens, on how to assist with reproductive rights, home violence, and childcare in the quarantine, on mutual aid models for the jobless, for instance, sex workers, write-ups on the implications of the pandemic on disability, environmentalism, or technology. All these notes were immediately translated into many languages, English, Italian, German, and were used widely. However, a couple of months into the pandemic, there was no longer a dearth, a lack of resources. There were resources much better than ours. And our aim was not so much in documenting practices, but in creating learning processes. So we have stopped this documenting effort and have gone back to our work with the pirate care practitioners. Our initial thinking was that the situation of pandemic crisis is really hard to read, and that theoretical takes, Begum mentioned Agamben, but there were sort of many floating around. Everybody was trying to give their hot take on what's happening now. We felt that they just cannot read the future, and in that sense, staying close to the practices we felt was a better reading of what's coming, what's the future. And I would say that to a degree was a failure of judgment, or it had limitations taking this approach. So slowly we have decided to take a distance, and that distance has in a way grown more and more critical over the last year. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment. So in a way, we have devoted our time since mid last year more to reflecting on what's happening, and also difficulty to reflect on what's happening, but also on the limitations of organizing that we've been documenting and thinking they're the sort of the closest reading of the pandemic. They still are in many ways, but many things have intervened in the meanwhile, and we think that requires also close reading, primarily state responses and market responses. The COVID-19 pandemic has made many of the pre-existing contradictions of social and ecological reproduction assume a starker relief and a novel configuration. So I would like to quickly mention a couple. First, caring is not intrinsically nice. It always involves power relations and processes of discipline, exclusion, and harm. It is a necessary and skilled form of labor that is shouldered by workers, who are mostly unwaged women and migrants, who themselves receive the least amount of care while serving those who take care labor for granted. Reciprocity and solidarity are not implied in care provision. To address this asymmetry, truth be told, practices that are emerging in the pandemic, but also practices we are interested in, pirate care practices, are experimenting with various forms of self-organization, alternative approaches to redistribution of labor, and the commoning of tools that to a degree address those asymmetries, which are also of gender and family and division of domestic work, as Begum has highlighted. Second, the famous graph that I mentioned, flatten the curve graph, represents two curves standing for higher and lower rates of contagion, both sort of exponential, but one sort of spiking more, the other remaining under sort of a straight line that represents the healthcare system capacity. So that healthcare system capacity, that line, is an ideal ceiling that the pandemic curve should not breach. However, that straight line is never a straight line nor a single line. It actually depicts in many ways the decline of many societies' capacity for care under the relentless neoliberalization and criminalization of care. Much in what has been termed the biggest crisis of care in this century isn't actually so new. With the pandemic, the pre-existing care crisis, until recently visible only on one side of the class, gender, and race divide, suddenly detonated as a generalized social threat. The lockdowns have revealed the fundamental dependence of societies on so-called essential services. the frontline workers in health and elderly care, in cleaning and food supply chain, or in transport, whose work is mostly invisible, devalued, and precarious, they really had no choice but to continue to go to work to not lose their employment and income. Largely composed of women, people of color, and migrants, they had to risk infection, and their communities were predictably some of the hardest hit by the disease. So in many ways, the asymmetry that were there and that were defined by sort of structural or systemic elements of class, gender, race remained there, and they amplified and replicated through the disease. Thirdly, now that we know much more about social etiology of the coronavirus, it is clear that those who were in the front line and on whom society depends for provision of care and reproductive labor, those who had really no choice but to go to work and who were hardest hit by the epidemic threat, will continue to remain on their side of the class, gender, and race divide. So it's baked in. We didn't find a way to address those divisions. So as I said, the current situation is hard to read. However, those couple of contradictions that I mentioned, they are not only limited to organizing of care labor, but they play themselves out at the political and systemic level as well, or if you wish, at the political and economic level as well. So one thing that we've been observing, that despite the wealth of grassroots solidarity initiatives and also unprecedented relief measures taken at the governmental level in various countries, this last year has tended to reinforce a situation where there is a political vacuum within community-based organizing. There is a lack of political organizing at the grander level. Although grassroots organizing stepped in to fill the vast gap created by the sudden upsurge in demand for various kinds of support that neither states nor markets were able or willing to adequately supply, strong political mobilization aimed at the failures of care systems, either locally or internationally, has remained largely subdued. There were protests, but they fade in comparison to the anti-lockdown protests. In contrast to reactions in other historical moments of major crises, there seems to have been serious difficulty in finding ways of organizing that are effective political responses to the current situation. For instance, implementing the kinds of welfare reform that would be necessary at the relevant scale to meet people's need in a crisis such as this one inevitably required a radical change to the taxation regime, yet that happened nowhere, no? Furthermore, caring for people's lives is increasingly being organized through regimes of property in deregulated labor markets. And these developments have only accelerated during the pandemic. Here I want to outline three trends. First one is the accelerated digitization of all aspects of life in the pandemic that has led to a significant transformation of labor conditions. Those who can work in the safety of their homes have come to depend on digital platforms for their work, for delivery of groceries and medicines, as well as for contact with their friends and families. While their needs were being catered to by a mushrooming army of low-wage care workers, warehouse pickers, and couriers who have had to continue moving along the logistical vectors. The pandemic lockdown thus has led to a precipitous increase in the rate at which both telework and provision work are being transformed into forms of what Ursula Haus has called logged labor, coordinated, quantified, and measured through apps and platforms. Similar processes have engulfed education, culture, and recreation Big tech corporations have readily embraced their central position in the coordination of this new pandemic life. Amazon, Deliveroo, and an endless roster of other delivery services have expanded to meet this exploding demand, unflinchingly piling pressure on their staff to work at a breakneck pace. In a parallel process, the kinds of tech companies that primarily command technology and data rather than human labor were aiming for an increase in public esteem. Google and Apple, for instance, could thus claim a role of benevolent public health advocates, creating a privacy-preserving contact tracing protocol and regularly releasing community mobility reports to monitor the effects of lockdown measures. Meanwhile, Zoom, WhatsApp, and other communication services were determining our capacity to work, socialize, and organize. Differences between those companies aside, this sudden dependence on private digital platforms, dubbed by Naomi Klein as Screen New Deal, has created a windfall for the techno-capitalist oligarchy. The financial markets, awash with money that had nowhere to be invested amid the largest global economic contraction since the Second World War, have also secured fantastic increases in their wealth. All of these companies will emerge from the current crisis ready to exert an inordinate impact on the future direction of societal development, and will be able to continue with their colonization of large parts of the provision and care economy. Second factor that I want to address is marketization of healthcare provision. Healthcare systems in many countries had already been deliberately disaggregated. High-value treatments had been privatized, and private clinics had been allowed to extract high returns, while public healthcare systems, there where they exist, were tasked with basic healthcare provision and disease prevention, areas that were constantly underfunded and under-resourced. With governments ignoring the warnings of scientists that an epidemic of this kind was only a matter of time, capacity to produce medical supplies and conduct epidemiological responses in the face of any such emergency had been severely cut over the years. Thus, governments found themselves dependent on the private sector for the speedy delivery of PPE equipment and test and trace procedures. This retreat from public provision is widespread, but it is arguably best evidenced in the field of high-tech medicines, where the domination of big pharma, together with the slow but ongoing process of divestment from public research and development, has led to reduced capacity for the production of medicines such as vaccines that could address public health concerns. The first COVID-19 vaccines were thus developed by venture capitalized private research startups. The unprecedented public funding they received and the advance orders for their vaccines placed prior to their finalization socialized the risk of developing these new remedies. But the resulting market valuations, profits, and patents will all remain private. The net effect of this market-dependent approach will be that the less affluent part of the world will be left to its own devices, unless countries with a strong public healthcare orientation and internationalist orientation, such as the economically struggling Cuba, produce their own vaccines and pass them on to generic drug producers. The novel approach to quick delivery of vaccines championed by BioNTech and Moderna is based on messenger RNA, which is also projected to be essential for custom treatments for cancer and heart diseases. This branch of medical research is dominated by private companies and closed patents. Future high-value precision medicines are thus likely to remain in private ownership, meaning that in the future, this model of development is likely to siphon off even more resources from public healthcare systems, making them even less capable of responding to future public health crises and making the availability of treatments even more highly uneven. And then thirdly, what these two processes share is that they are part of an accelerated conversion of human labor and care provision into assets. that is a specific kind of private property which focuses on profits from the rising value of financial assets rather than the production of goods. This is part of the wider trend towards the financialization of ever larger categories of goods and services. And it provides the basis for financial capital to exert control over the future development of large swaths of social systems, without necessarily holding directly ownership or responsibility for them. And essential care provision, such as health, assistance to the elderly, housing, education, and so on, are increasingly being assetized, while at the same time, the pensions, healthcare insurance, and savings of many ordinary people have come to depend on the income generated by the same processes of assetization. Assetization is thus progressively locking ever larger members of society, or ever larger parts of society, into a trend of development that will create even more radical segregation, while expropriating us from our very capacity to shape the future. To conclude, the wave of community-driven organizing witnessed with the onset of the pandemic were geared towards filling the gaps created by insufficient capacity, bureaucratic negligence, and deliberate exclusion across the institutional landscape of care provision. Such organizing is, however, situated and localized, while the mechanisms driving the development of the contemporary institutional landscape of care provision are structural and global. Assetization creates self-reinforcing mechanisms that seriously limit the future possibilities for institutional transformation and preempt any change of direction towards more socialized and responsive care provision. In the absence of other means to mobilize around the future of care provision, we sort of, Valeria, Marcel, and I have been thinking that it is urgent that the laws which support such imperial processes of assetization, or the regimes that support such imperial processes of assetization, and the intensification of unequal division of labor are to be disobeyed, and that disobedience needs to be politicized. In a way, to come back to where I started, we think that collective organizing of care is a growing need of piracy and politicization of disobedience, because over the last year we have sort of seen a suspension of politics, and that suspension of politics has a lot to do with the authoritarianism that Begum has talked about, but also there has been a year of etatism and dirigism that has sort of precluded any significant contestation, particularly of sort of the driving mechanisms behind the processes that I have described, the sort of growing precarization of labor aided through digital networks, privatization of healthcare provision, particularly of medicines, and then assetization of various systems of care provision, both healthcare, but also elderly care. So I think that's the least we can do at this moment to contest the situation where sort of the states are really running the show, and they're running it with the reliance on the markets. And we can't really say that those responses were anything else but sort of a struggle, and in many cases failures, as well.
Thank you very much, Tomislav. We are a little bit over our time, but still I would like to ask our audience if they have any questions, comments of this very intense presentations that we were actually hoping for. And I'm sorry, it's I have my own care crisis here.
Hey, hello.
More than welcome.
Merhaba Mayıs.
She cannot hear you. Okay, a little bit question and comment shyness.
Yes, since I can't see any questions from the audience at the moment. So maybe just to conclude, I wanted to bring one issue, or maybe share with you. I don't know if that's going to be a very concrete question, but rather, of course, I kind of recognize a sort of failures or mechanisms of failures that you both described when it comes to the solidarity and the kind of abusing or marketizing the very issue of solidarity. And I just wanted to share with you maybe the very reason, or maybe some of the reflections we did have during the Grand Reunion process so far around this topic, and this idea that in a way, on one hand, we tried through this very small scale self-organized process to I guess what we experienced was a kind of attempt to practice being together, or maybe practice or make it an attempt to feel the presence of each other, even though the live gathering has not been possible. And I guess, especially for the choreography makers, that has been extremely difficult because what is really at the core of the choreography practice, which is a kind of embodiment of the meeting, has not been possible. And I am wondering whether, but even though we were kind of deprived from that ability to feel each other, the very regularity of the Grand Reunion gatherings happening every month, and the kind of openness of the frame, at least for some of us, or maybe here I should speak only for like my own personal reactions, were extremely helpful in order to go through this last months. And I'm wondering, of course, not having the too many expectations over, for instance, how deep we can go in the debates over the tools we have at the moment. I am wondering whether you have any kind of particular experience also related with your own communities that were kind of keeping you standing during this process, and were kind of letting the practice to be continued and to be your own practice, and to, in a way, to host it or to make it happen or to keep standing. Whether you have any strategies or experience you might like to share, or observations.
Begum, would you like to go first, or would you like me to take it?
Yeah, go ahead. I will sort of bring my mind together if you already have an
I don't have a definite answer, but I can stumble my way through an answer.
Yeah, okay, I will stumble right after you.
Yeah, so, well, I think in many ways, this current situation is exceptional. No, I have lived through a war in the early 90s, and that really, or sort of both the breakdown of the society I grew up in, and then the breakdown, the war that ensued in Yugoslavia. And that really was an extraordinary time. And to many degrees, one could think in parallels to the present moment, no? Like great death and great social uncertainty. It's no war. Luckily, it's very different than war, I would say. There is no carnage and horrorism of that the war brings, but definitely the sense of caesura or sort of break is there. And in many ways, because of Pirate Care, things sort of continued for me. I didn't have that caesura. I had sort of too much work to do what we were doing with this project, because suddenly there was so much of it, of organizing. And still, I think that I took break from many things, and I stayed in one place, and things changed radically. So I think maybe ability to not try to reconstruct the continuity was what defined for me the last year. So that would be an improvised answer, but obviously some interdependencies grew stronger. I think that's evident. No, my mom is really very old, and she depended basically on other people's assistance to self-isolate for over a year. You know, that kind of reinforced certain relationships, but then a lot of interdependencies were not just there. Like 3 months ago, I was really, really sad after an acquaintance. He's sort of flight designer in theater. I also have sort of former career in theater, passed away. And had the circumstances been sort of normal, we would have encountered each other, and we didn't, you know. And there was a definite sense of loss of interdependence that creates a lot of the texture of my life, at least, you know. So I don't know, I was feeling sad about that. Yeah, it's a year and more, so things have changed over that period, but these are just some thoughts that I have sort of on more personal level.
Thanks so much, Tomislav. Begum, would you like to?
Yeah, a few words on my side, actually. Like looking backwards, the past 10 years at least, that I've been involved with such practices of solidarity, mutual aid, like migrant solidarity work that we've been doing. The only continuous thing was this notion of failure. We failed constantly in many different ways. So that was the only continuity. I mean, like, I'm obviously exaggerating and making a caricature here, but like for me, what was important is first of all to accept that there is this moment of failure, and you have to think about what makes you fail, other than your, you know, wonderful critique of the neoliberal state and this and that. But at the same time, like, I bumped into this this idea, as I mentioned in my talk as well, that like we have to maybe look more closely to the ways in which people actually do survive by leaning all on already existing networks of solidarity, which is not, you know, equally formed. As Tomislav said, care is basically a power relation, and people rely on such asymmetrical power relations, but it keeps them alive against the neoliberal state. And the left has absolutely almost nothing to say there. So like these already existing networks of solidarity and care, based on religious identity, or I don't know, cultural identity actually works very fine. I'm not saying that we should copy those kind of networks, but we should take into consideration the way they operate so well, which makes our work sometimes impossible. So that has to do with like the way we fail, obviously, but I think thinking about that forms of failure is let's say as important as you know, building something instead of this networks of solidarity, I would say.
Thanks a lot, Begum. Maybe I will also read out loud one comment, maybe more a comment than a question that we have from Keith. I really appreciate both presentations. There are many parallels with the situation in the US, in particular in the Bay Area. That is, the ways that the pandemic exposed the crisis of care within neoliberal context, the ways that state care both co-opted community and do-it-yourself tactics, and then were completely inadequate for the needs that were experienced asymmetrically. One of our current struggles is with rent relief and inadequate and overly bureaucratic state funding for unpaid rent. Obviously, thanks so much, Keith, for that comment. Obviously, that's also one of the places where the kind of amplification of the previously present crisis happened really strongly during the pandemic outbreak. Definitely, I guess US was one of these cases that the privatization of the and capitalization of the care became kind of became visible, like it almost exploded in front of our eyes. Are there any more questions, or I don't see any in the chat? Zaina, would you like to comment, or?
I did have some questions, but we are like overly extended our time, so I will leave it to our next meeting somewhere on Earth, hopefully not on digital mediums. So thank you very much, both Tomislav and Begum, and I hope you a nice weekend. I don't know who can go out, who is staying at home, but I hope you have a very nice weekend.
Likewise. And I wish
Likewise.
us all that we emerge from this sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
Healthy.
Thanks a lot. And
Thank
take care.
you.
Thank you all. Take
Ciao,
care.
everyone.
Ciao.
Ciao.